My name's Amata, and in this Red Gaming Tech video I am here with some pretty awesome news for those planning to get Far Cry 5 on the PC, as we have the system requirements for the game. Now usually this would just be like minimum recommended, sometimes ultra, but we've actually got minimum recommended 4K 30 and 4K 60, which is pretty nice, and also explanations as to what resolution each setting actually is, which is always appreciated because sometimes they don't say, and kind of leave you to guess what they mean by minimum. Like, is that 720p? Is that 1080? Like, help me out here. So, I'm going to go through the features that Ubisoft have detailed after the specs, but let's get to the meat of the video first. Let's begin things with the minimum specs for this particular game. So, surprising nobody ever, we have Windows 7 8.1 and Windows 10 64-bit versions as the required OS, hardly shocking. CPU-wise, however, you'll need at least an Intel Core i5-2400 at 3.1 GHz or an AMD FX 6300 at 3.5 GHz or, of course, equivalent. Now, the real question, of course, is the graphics card, and here we have the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 670 or AMD R9 270. That has to be with the 2GB of VRAM as well. Speaking of RAM, or, well, different type of RAM, but still, we've got 8GB of RAM required. Now, for those of you wondering, this is at a 720p resolution at low video preset, so this is the absolute lowest you can go. So, do keep that in mind when thinking of purchasing this game on the PC. However, let's get to what most of you are probably going to be more interested in, which is the recommended, which is, of course, is going to be for 1080p 60. Unsurprisingly, the OS remains the same. However, of course, we have a fairly significant jump in the requirements for the CPU and, of course, the GPU. Let's begin with the CPU, of course, with the Intel i7-4770 at 3.4 GHz or AMD Ryzen 5 1600, that's just the 1600, not the 1600X, at 3.2 GHz or equivalent. So, pretty meaty, I'm sure you would agree. You know, while Ryzen is reasonably priced, this is obviously getting up there in terms of total cost, especially when you consider that it also recommended requires GTX 970 or AMD R9 290X with 4GB of VRAM. Interestingly enough, however, this also does still require 8GB of RAM. Doesn't take a RAM jump until we get to the 4K gang. As I already said, this is for 1080p 60. However, this is for the high video preset. So, again, this is for high. And it does go up to ultra according to these specs that I have here. So do keep that in mind, that if you want to knock it up to ultra, obviously you've got to bring a lot more than this. But this is, again, for 60. Obviously, if you're happy to take a few hits on the frames, if you have pretty much these specs or similar, you can, of course, crank it all the way to ultra. Just be prepared to it not be a smooth and solid 60 based upon these recommended specs. Obviously, your mileage may vary, as it always tends to do. So, let's get on to the 4K, shall we? Let's begin with the 4K 30 FPS recommended specs. Interestingly enough, we do have a change here for the OS. It's Windows 10 only, and we have an Intel Core i7-6700 at 3.4 GHz or an AMD Ryzen 5 1600X 3.6 GHz or equivalent being recommended. And the graphics card is going to be painfully expensive if you have to upgrade, as they are recommending the GeForce GTX 1070 or the AMD RX Vega 56 with 8GB of VRAM. Now, given that those two cards in particular are pretty damn popular with miners at the moment, they're going to be even more expensive than they otherwise would be, so it's going to be a bit eye-watering if you really want to get that 4K 30 going on Far Cry 5. It's going to cost you a pretty penny, but I doubt people would spend that much to upgrade for one game. But hey, if you're thinking of upgrading anyway, and this game is really a game that you want to play, and you're thinking of 1070s, and I guess you could take the plunge. Personally, I wouldn't, but that's just me. I would wait for the prices to come down, but of course, it's a very subjective thing. As I said, we do take the jump from 8GB to 16GB of RAM here, and of course the resolution here is 2160p, and interestingly enough, this again is for the high video preset, and this is again for 4K 30 FPS, so you can't really crank it any higher, unless of course, you want to turn the resolution down, which obviously if you're playing at 4K is not something you particularly want to do unless you absolutely had to do it. You probably take it down to 1440p or something like that. However, let's get to the beefiest of the beef, and that is, of course, 4K 60. Again, we have Windows 10 only being recommended here. However, the most interesting part, of course, is going to be the CPU, which of course is Intel Core i7-6700K at 4 GHz or a AMD Ryzen 7 1700X at 3.4 GHz or equivalent. And on the GPU side, and prepare yourself because this is going to sting you just thinking about it, you need a NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080 SLI or an AMD RX Vega 56 in Crossfire. So yeah, that would be pretty damn expensive if you were to do that. Obviously, if you already have one, then obviously it's not as bad, but I doubt many people are going to be like, do you know what? I'm just going to drop like an insane amount of money to get two 1080s at the moment. Yeah, why not? RAM is the same, and of course so is the resolution, but what is interesting is the video preset listed here is high or ultra. So yeah, that is pretty much the tippy top of what you're going to have to bring to the party here for Far Cry 5 at 4K 60. Unsurprising to anybody, this game is extremely demanding at higher resolutions. Not exactly the surprise of the century, but it is still pretty damn impressive, the specs that you're going to need to bring to the table. Now, there's actually a quite interesting article over at PC Games N who have worked out exactly how much it would cost you to play this game on 4K. I will include a link to them in the description below this video because I think it's worth a read, and it just pains me just looking at the price, which is around $2,500 or $2,500 to say it a different way. Obviously, some parts could be tweaked, like you drop the 1 terabyte hard drive, for instance, and that sort of thing. But the rest of it is pretty much like, hey, yeah, this memory, maybe drop the SSD, but even then you're only losing $100. Like, you're still looking in the $2,000 range easily, to be honest. Given the specs that they're saying, it's hardly surprising. And, half of that cost is the 1080s, unsurprisingly. So, yeah. Be prepared to shell out if you want to run this game at 4K 60, but even at the lower resolutions, obviously it's going to be the more common resolutions, the sort of minimum and recommended, you still have to have a fairly modern rig. This is definitely not going to be for those of you who haven't upgraded in a few years, unless of course you are happy to run it at the lowest possible settings and the lowest possible resolution, which of course is entirely valid. That is the joy of PC gaming, that you can tweak your experience based upon your hardware and play preferences and all that. So, with all that said, thank you very much for watching. Your support is always appreciated. I'll see you next time.